What is going on, everybody? Welcome to this edition of Afterthoughts, where we recap UFC Singapore. Great event, up and down. You know, those early morning cards here in the United States. You know, sometimes they get a bad rap. A lot of people say, well, they're not really deep enough for me to watch, for me to get up early and watch some fights. But these, for my money, were definitely worth getting up at 4:30 in the morning and catching all the way through. Obviously, the main event, DEMIAN MAIA and Ben Askren. Now, I think there was... I mean, I had seen predictions about this fight all over the place. I mean, some people were saying it's going to be a stand-up fight, mostly, because both guys are such good at grappling. Neither one's going to want to engage in the grappling. I've seen people, including myself, who said that Ben Askren was just going to take DEMIAN MAIA down and just control the fight for 5 rounds, or at least, you know, do enough to where he'd win a decision. And then there were people who thought the fight would become a grappling exchange and DEMIAN would submit Ben Askren, which is, of course, what happened. Now, naturally, I got all of my predictions with this fight completely wrong, because that's how this works sometimes. Because I thought Askren, like I said, was going to just take him down and control the fight, you know, not necessarily finish it. I don't think... I mean, I never would think DEMIAN MAIA would get submitted. But I thought Askren was going to do enough to where he would control the action. You know, this is a guy who has gone up against some great strikers. I mean, Robbie Lawler, Douglas Lima, Lyman Good, Koreshkov. I mean, this guy has fought some really high-level strikers, and... you know, I figured, well, if DEMIAN MAIA does decide to strike with him, it's not really going to mean much, because Askren has fought strikers far better than DEMIAN MAIA has. But in this instance, I think it really just came down to DEMIAN MAIA. We all underestimated, or at least I think the vast majority of us forgot just how good DEMIAN MAIA is, and just how dominant his jiu-jitsu is. I mean, this is a guy who a few years ago was just tearing through everybody. I mean, I'll never forget that fight against Carlos Condit when he got that late submission win, or early submission win, not late, early submission win, the late submission win against Neil Magny. And, you know, he was just tearing through the welterweight division up until he got that title fight with Woodley. Gets that fight with Woodley, loses that fight, then loses to Covington, then loses to Usman. Now, those are the 3 best welterweights in the world right now. I think most people would agree with that statement. And, you know, the fact that DEMIAN lost to them, I think now, looking in hindsight, we see it and we're like, okay, well, those were the 3 best guys. And he managed to go to a decision with all 3 of them. And all 3 of those guys have really good anti-wrestling and don't get taken down very often. So, we all, I think, kind of assumed that in a fight against a high-level wrestler, because we had seen it, DEMIAN was gonna struggle in this fight. Truth of the matter is that Askren's a different style of wrestler than Covington, Woodley, or Usman. Askren's much more of a chain wrestler. He's gonna... you know, he's not going to necessarily pressure you. He's just going to shoot right at you, similar to how Khabib does it. And, you know, it works. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but against DEMIAN MAIA, apparently it didn't work as well as Askren thought it would. And I think we all really underestimated DEMIAN MAIA. And we had that thought in our minds about the Woodley, Covington, and Usman fights, completely disregarding the fact that the guy has submitted so many high-level wrestlers in his career. I mean, I mentioned Neil Magny, but also Rick Story. Gunnar Nelson didn't submit Gunnar Nelson, but Gunnar Nelson's one of the best transitional grapplers in MMA. I mean, the guy tore through the welterweight division at one point, and I really think a lot of this was because we forgot about just how dominant DEMIAN MAIA is when he does get to the ground. Because that was as clinical a grappling performance as I've seen out of DEMIAN MAIA in a long time. He looked vintage in that fight. Now, he looked great against Lyman Good when they fought back in February. Didn't look so great against Rocco Martin back in June. But this was like vintage DEMIAN MAIA. I mean, he, went to the ground and instantly transitioned into advantageous positions. So great performance from Demian Maia up and down. And I don't think he's going to get back into title contention. I really think he's firmly locked into this role. He'll always be a top 15 guy, but, he'll never be at that championship level again. But he's always going to be fun to watch. He's always going to be a fan favorite, and he's always going to be one of those guys that no matter what happens with him, or at least, no matter who he beats or what happens, I'm going to be a fan of him. I'm a huge fan of Demian Maia. And I didn't really have a rooting interest in this fight, but I am happy that he won. Now moving on to, of course, Ben Askren. And I think for Askren, this is really a big crossroads I think he's facing now. I think he's really in a position where he needs to look at everything. And what I mean when I say that is I don't think he's going to get released. This isn't the old school UFC where they, cut you after 2 fights. My external hard drive was falling down there. But this isn't the old school UFC where they cut you after 2 fights. So he will stick around. He'll get another fight at least. But I think really for Ben Askren, this is one of those moments where I think he needs to really evaluate what's going on. Because, as we've all heard and as we all remember, undefeated when he came into the UFC. Gets that fight against Robbie Lawler. Ends controversially. Then he gets, embarrassed by Masvidal. And now tonight gets out-grappled by Demian Maia. So even though he does hold a win in the UFC against the former champion, no less, when you look at Askren's resume in the UFC, there is a lot of criticism and there's a lot of questions, like, say, well, yeah, he beat Robbie Lawler, but did he really beat Robbie Lawler? Should that fight have been finished? Did he really, put Lawler out? Now, in my opinion, he did, but again, that's another conversation altogether. I think, when people look at Askren's UFC career, it's going to be put into question, and his legacy is going to be put into question. Which is unfortunate, because I think Ben Askren, at a point in time, was probably one of the 3 best welterweights in the world, along with GSP and Johnny Hendricks. When he was in Bellator, absolutely decimating their welterweight division, he looked the part of somebody who could be a UFC champion one day. Now, whether or not the UFC acquired him too late, that's a conversation all, in and of itself, but I think if you're Ben Askren and I don't think the UFC will release him. I don't think they should release him. Again, let me make that very clear. But I think if you're Ben Askren, you really need to evaluate everything here and be very cautious in taking your next fight, because he's the kind of guy now where he's in a position, he's already a gatekeeper, which, when he first came into the UFC earlier this year and, looked emphatic, no one thought he would have been in this position. Definitely not this soon. And I would really be careful with who I matchmake him up with next. Because if you give him a prospect, if you give him like a Jeff Neal or a Nico Price, he should be able to out-grapple him, but both of those guys are incredibly dangerous on the ground. The UFC really needs to be careful with what they do with Ben Askren here. I wouldn't give him a ranked opponent next. I think he needs to at least get one more win, get his confidence back, because he's gotten outclassed his last 2 performances. So I think Ben Askren really needs to take a look in the mirror and see what he needs to do from here, because this is a very interesting predicament that he's never been in, and I think the UFC needs to matchmake him differently going forward. Moving on down the card, I'm going to spend a brief amount of time on Michael Johnson and Stevie Ray. The fight really wasn't that big. It wasn't that important in terms of makeup in the division. I think Michael Johnson won that fight. If he didn't win the fight, it was a draw because of that last round. I think Stevie Ray, in theory, could have done enough to get a 10-8. But Michael Johnson's another one of those guys. Like, it's really hard to understand Michael Johnson's career because he's beaten... he beat Tony Ferguson, he beat Dustin Poirier, he beat Edson Barboza. The guy has beaten, elite lightweights, guys who are now at the top of the division. Think about it this way. He's fought 4 of the top 5 lightweights. He's fought Khabib, Tony, Poirier and Gaethje. I mean, the only one he hasn't fought is Conor. And he's 2-2 against them, too. You know, he beat Poirier and Tony and gave Khabib and Justin both a lot of problems when he fought him. So, Johnson's a weird guy. You know, the fact that he's losing to a guy like Stevie Ray is very bizarre. Now, again, for my money, he won that fight. I scored it 2-1 for Johnson. But it's hard to really pinpoint what the deal's with Michael Johnson. I think it's just he's wildly inconsistent. And there's really nothing more to say than that. He's never going to be a champion, you know, but he'll always be a guy that delivers good fights, and he's always going to be a guy that people can measure themselves up with. You know, Stevie Ray, that was his best performance. You know, a guy who got knocked out by Leonardo Santos earlier in the year, a guy who's a jiu-jitsu fighter, goes in there and beats a guy who beat Tony Ferguson. It's how this sport works sometimes. But Johnson's another one of those guys I think he really needs to consider his options moving forward. I think lightweight's the division for him, but they need to matchmake him wisely going forward. Maybe give him Leonardo Santos. Maybe give him... goodness gracious, I mean, lightweight is such a shark tank that you really have to give him somebody like way on the outside looking in. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Michael Johnson going forward. I want to speak about CIRYL GANE because he's fantastic. I mean, that kid, you know, I mentioned on my podcast, he is one of the brightest prospects in all of MMA. He, for my money, is the brightest heavyweight prospect in the UFC. Now, I don't know if you consider Rosenstruik a prospect still. Now, he's about to fight Arlovsky, and assuming he beats Arlovsky, which I think he will, he'll jump into contention. So if you take out Rosenstruik, CIRYL GANE is he's the best lightweight, or best heavyweight prospect, I should say, in MMA. I mean, that guy is so technically sound. Switches stances effortlessly, light on his feet, great cardio. I mean, for a heavyweight, he's got insane cardio. Very well rounded. I mean, the guy's a knockout artist, but his first 2 UFC wins have come by submission. He's a lot closer to the top 15 than I think. I'd like to see him fight a guy like a Tuivasa next, or maybe even the loser of Derek Lewis and Ivanov, because he's a lot closer to that top 15. Like, he's one fight away, in my opinion. He and Rosenstruik both are just, they're so bright, and I can't wait to see Rosenstruik this weekend, and assuming he wins, he'll jump into the top 15, and I think CIRYL GANE's right behind him, because CIRYL GANE looks so good. I mean, it'd be criminal if he doesn't at least co-headline that UFC France card coming up next year. You know, having Ngannou headline and then have GANE be the co-headliner. Because he's fun to watch, and he's fantastic. And then I want to wrap this up with MOVSAR EVLOEV, the featherweight prospect who defeated Barzola on the prelims. EVLOEV's an interesting guy, too, just like GANE. You know, he's had 2 fights in the UFC, and he's already clearly fit enough to compete with the top 15. Barzola's a guy who's always been that, like, stepping stone. You know, you beat Enrique Barzola, you jump into the top 15. And I think he's going to... I think now, when you look at EVLOEV, he deserves that top 15 guy next. The first name that came to mind after this win, Andre Fili. Because he and Fili are in about the same position, where they're just on that outside looking in, and they could both do wonders if they fight each other. It'd be a fantastic fight. And EVLOEV's a very bright prospect, because he's a guy who... He's the former M1 champion, and of course, if you're a champion in any organization coming to the UFC, or at least any legitimate organization like M1, you know, you're going to have a very bright pedigree coming in. You know, but this guy, I think he's just like CIRYL GANE, I think he's ready for that top 15 already. I think he could fight a guy like an Andre Fili, or I'm trying to think of the top 15 off the top of my head. I wouldn't give him a guy like Yusuf. I think that's too dangerous. But maybe like an Arnold Allen would be a good one for him, because he's a very bright prospect. And his championship pedigree from M1, I think, is going to do wonders for him. He's a very big guy for featherweight, too. So I'm very excited about both CIRYL GANE and MOVSAR EVLOEV going forward. I think they're both very, very bright future contenders. But anyways, guys, Thanks for watching this edition of Afterthoughts. My name is Johann Castro. Tune in next time. Enjoy the fights, everyone.